You know it's election time when the scare campaigns are coming out. And so it is that Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese have launched another Medi-Scare campaign, claiming that Peter Dutton is going to gut Medicare. But it points to a broader problem. During the campaign from both major parties, we need to be on the lookout for some rather false and misleading statements. Now, at the moment, the Liberal Party and Peter Dutton have been relatively quiet, at least as far as I've seen, they haven't been in full campaign mode. However, the Labour Party certainly is, with a couple of announcements that certainly leave something to be desired, at least in the accuracy department. So let's have a look at this, to look at the broader issue of truth in political advertising, which is sorely lacking. And if you've got any thoughts about the campaign and any thoughts about the truthfulness or lack thereof of politicians, let me know that in the comments below. Now, the first one I want to talk about is alcohol and taxes on brewers. In particular, Anthony Albanese came out and said they were delivering a massive tax cut to brewers, so alcohol manufacturers and the like. Now, that massive tax cut was made to look like it was a support for small business, a support for locally made alcohol. There would be a local industry that would be important to the economy. And it was looking like a favour to all Australians. After all, there's been rather heavy criticism of the alcohol excise. However, when we dig beneath the headlines, which Anthony Albanese clearly and rather unsurprisingly didn't actually link to, we can see some policy details. And the policy details tell us a rather different story. What effectively is happening here is the government has, for a little while now, given an alcohol excise rebate up to $350,000. That figure was set all the way back in 2021. Now, that rebate is designed to make it more viable for small manufacturers, and that's useful to have in place. So what exactly is Anthony Albanese doing in relation to helping out these brewers now? Well, they're adjusting up that rebate from $350,000 per year to $400,000, starting in 2026. So in essence, what we're seeing here is 5 years down the track, they've adjusted up the rebate $50,000. It still is not inflation indexed. It still is not going to change with the cost of doing business or anything similar. It's a one-off adjustment that basically just offsets inflation to the tune of $50,000. So what does this tell us? A, there is not a massive tax cut for these brewers. B, it starts in 2026, not right now. And C, it is really just inflation indexing a prior rebate. This would be much like saying that if you inflation index tax brackets, that's somehow a tax cut. No, it isn't. It's doing what already should have been the case. Then we've got another announcement of Medicare. I already talked about the Medi-Scare campaign, where they're saying Peter Dutton is going to gut Medicare, although those claims are rather short on actual detail and rather long on out-of-context quotes. Nevertheless, their latest announcement relates to Medicare, where Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers have gone out and claimed that almost every Australian will now have access to bulk-billed GP visits. Now, a bulk-billed GP visit is when the visit is purely paid for by Medicare and you have no immediate out-of-pocket. Now, of course, you will still ultimately pay through tax, but there's no immediate payment. Now, if we dig into the announcement, we can actually see the truth is rather different from what the announcement says. The truth is, in essence and in short, that what they're going to do is they're going to try to incentivize GPs to only bulk bill patients. So they'll give an incentive payment to practices that do this. Now, the problem with this, of course, is the incentive payment is not big enough to offset the losses the GP practices would bear by only bulk billing. I.e., if you only bulk bill patients, you're going to get less money than if you were to pay them or charge them privately. And that's because the bulk billing rebate has simply not increased for eons, and therefore GPs would be out of pocket. There's a significant gap, because again, that bulk billing rebate the GPs would get is simply not inflation indexed, and therefore it doesn't keep pace with the cost of doing business. Now, what the government is going to do is bring in an incentive to try to convince GPs to only bulk bill patients. But that would not offset the entire magnitude of the loss they would otherwise bear. What this means is they're basically saying to GPs, you take the loss so we can get a political announcement for the election. Ultimately, this would fail entirely, because GPs would simply not sign on to the scheme, and therefore GPs would simply not partake in it, and you would not get bulk billing for everyone, as Anthony Albanese is claiming. All they really needed to do is inflation index the Medicare rebate, which would reduce the amount by which patients are out of pocket. However, they are not doing this, and they've decided not to do this for a very long time, which is why we're in the position that we're in right now. And this also exacerbates the GP shortage, because GPs realize that they're just going to be treated like political footballs, so no medical training doctor is going to become a GP. It's rather clear. However, again, nothing is being done to address the underlying issue. Rather, it's just looking for short-term political announcements that really are not going to work. Then we have Jim Chalmers and his asinine claims that they have increased employment, reduced debt, and lowered inflation. Now let's focus on the reduced debt bit. They have not reduced debt. Debt has gone up slightly under the Albanese government. To be fair, it has not skyrocketed under the government, which is a good thing. However, it has certainly not decreased. It increased certainly a lot more under Morrison during the COVID era, when they went out and borrowed a ton of money for the stimulus during the COVID era. However, it is still forced to claim that Anthony Albanese has reduced debt, because they have not. Then we get the issue that they've lowered inflation. Headline inflation has certainly decreased. I'll grant Jim Chalmers that. However, underlying inflation is stubbornly high and above the RBA's target range of 3%. The underlying problem here is that Jim Chalmers has done one-off temporary subsidies to get headline inflation down, papering over an underlying mess. Basically, it's kind of like fiddling the books to some extent. That's at least my interpretation of it. Basically, just trying to create the appearance of inflation decreasing. However, when those subsidies expire, those prices are going to ratchet right back up to where they were, creating an inflation spike, something that Jim Chalmers seemingly doesn't like to talk about. Then the fact that the government spending is actually making inflation worse, because by spending more and more money, they are putting more and more stimulus into the economy, raising prices. Then we have the employment situation. I wonder how many of those jobs are government-linked or directly within the government. After all, Jim Chalmers is rather quiet on how many of those jobs are private sector jobs. And if your government just spends more and more money hiring people, then of course you can get unemployment down by just hoovering up all of the employees. That is not a win, it just bloats the public service and creates an underlying structural deficit. So we can see again that Jim Chalmers is being misleading. Anthony Albanese is being misleading. The ALP is misleading Australian voters heading into the election. So much for truth in political advertising. Now this neatly tells us that the election campaign is upon us, and we're going to see a lot of false, misleading, and downright inaccurate claims from probably both major parties. At the moment, the Labour Party is doing the major culprit, because they are in government and they have the loud megaphone. However, I'm sure that the coalition will have their fair share of rather inaccurate political posts. It's just that I haven't seen nearly as much from them at the moment. Maybe they get less media coverage because the media seems to love the ALP. Maybe they just haven't gotten their act together. Whatever the case might be, the ALP appears to be rather ahead at the moment in the misleading, scaremongering, and simply inaccurate political advertising. And it's something that we need to watch out for in the upcoming election campaign. Now, of course, let me know your thoughts about any of these supposed policy improvements that we seem to be supposedly having, because I don't think any of them are actually good policy. But let me know your thoughts about them anyway. And let me know your thoughts about either major party in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. And otherwise, hopefully I see you next time as well.